It is our original interview with Daniel Pinchbeck from February of 2003 on his amazing book, Breaking Open the Head. And this is a long, searching, fascinating, absolutely wonderful interview, one of the best I ever did. It's marred a bit by the fact that we were still in the infancy of audio transmission over the Internet, and it's not of the quality that you're used to hearing now. There's a bit of sort of a background noise in it, but you can listen through it quite easily to the interview itself, and it is still wonderful, even after all of this time. I listened to it a moment ago. I was thinking, you hear me in there inveigling against all of the cruelties that are that come along with the soul blindness that's developing in our world. And I mentioned reality TV. Gosh, how times have changed in just a few years. I would have been 2003. I didn't think to mention something like what's going on in Iraq and all of the other terrible things that are taking place around us. But yes, innocence fades so very quickly. It's quite a remarkable interview, and I had a lot of fun doing it. A lot of you, after the recent Daniel Pinchbeck show, asked that this interview be repeated, and so here it is. And enjoy Breaking Open the Head. He turned out to be that book, a kind of watershed in our consciousness about who and what we are. It was a very, very important book, and I think the deepest and most complete interview he ever gave, because there's hardly a program left out there where somebody can be interviewed in this depth by an interviewer who's actually read what they've written or knows a little bit at least about what they're doing in just a few shows. Proud that this is one of them, and have a great Thanksgiving 2006. Now here, going back to 2003 in a few seconds, are Whitley Strieber and Daniel Pinchbeck. Coming up on Dreamland over the next few weeks, we've got a lot of great stuff. William Henry's going to be with us to talk about his new Star Walkers book. Colin Wilson will be with us to talk about, of all things, the civilization of the Neanderthals and what may have really been going on back in the distant past. The legendary Colin Wilson, you heard that right. And so much else is coming up on Dreamland, so don't miss a single week. We're going strong, even after all of these years. I've been on the air, I guess, 7 or 8 years with Dreamland now, and enjoyed every minute of it, and I hope you do too. You could subscribe, by the way, to UnknownCountry.com and get a free copy of the hardcover Superstorm autographed by yours truly. I have autographed 25 copies, and you can get one absolutely free if you subscribe to Unknown Country for a 1 year, any 1 year subscription, new 1 year subscription. And we will send you a free autographed copy of Superstorm sometime next week, so you could conceivably give it as a Christmas present. Lovely idea, so please do support us with a subscription. We need you. Okay, here we go. Whitley Strieber, Daniel Pinchbeck, 2003.
I'm very happy to be talking to Daniel Pinchbeck, the author of a really, really cool book, Breaking Open the Head, a psychedelic journey into the heart of contemporary shamanism. As you know, something is missing in the Western world. People are going soul blind, they are soul dead, they are losing their touch with the numinous, and they are turning into, well, you see what's happening all around you. Reality television, unbelievable cruelties, people who no longer care about the value of their own beings. Well, someone like Daniel Pinchbeck does care. He cares a whole lot. He is a founding editor of Open City. He's written for such publications as Rolling Stone, Men's Journal, The Village Voice. He has been around the block also in a very extraordinary area. Daniel has gone on a journey, a psychedelic journey, that's right, into contemporary shamanism, taking psychedelics in different places all around the world in order to find out if they open a window into the spirit. And Daniel, I'm very, very happy to have you with us.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, it's been an exciting experience reading your book. I have to admit that I would be severely punished by my school librarian for dog-earing all these pages in here. This is just so exciting. You know, we had the author of DMT, The Spirit Molecule, on this radio program about a year ago, but that was before it was all internet, and there were a lot of things I couldn't say because, they wouldn't let me have you on, for example, because you had taken your psychedelics not under official supervision at all, but you did it in other countries where it was legal where you did it, but that didn't matter.
Right.
Now I'm free, and therefore we can talk about anything we want to. Anyway, we had him on, and he made a remarkable discovery for a professor, during the course of his work, which he talked about on the air much more fully than in the book, and that's why I want to tell you what he said. He said that he felt that the people he was studying, who he was giving DMT to, were actually seeing into another world, and he had come to that conclusion really almost as he was finishing his book. Mm-hmm. Now, how do you react to that?
Well, I mean, it's not surprising to me at this point. I feel that there are, lots of other worlds at this point. I don't even know if worlds is the right word. I'm not sure dimensions is the right word. I think we're going to learn that, there are different forms of consciousness that manifest in different ways. They may be connected to, rates of vibration or resonance, or we may need some kind of, more scientific vocabulary at some point. Mm-hmm. But what's really exciting is that this is, just when science feels it's got sort of things sewn up, this is a whole area that, there's been a lot of repression and a lot of fear, and a lot of confusion about. But it's an area of human curiosity that in the next millennium we're going to be putting a lot of energy into understanding.
You mention in your book, for over 30 years, a tremendous force of cultural repression has been exerted on the subject of psychedelics. Could you give us a little bit of the history of psychedelics in our country and what happened to blind us to this?
Sure. Well, basically in the 50s, LSD was discovered in the 1940s. And then the 1950s, it had like two tracks. On the one hand, the CIA was kind of investigating it. On the other hand, these psychotherapists and intellectuals and psychoanalysts began to work with it. And they were very amazed by what it did, and began to use it in different therapeutic ways. And this whole exploratory phase where it was used for obsessive, LSD and psilocybin mushrooms were being used for obsessive compulsive disorder and alcoholism, and bringing down recidivism rates in prisoners in jail. And there were a lot of very positive potentials there. But then the kind of genie got out of the bottle in the mid-'60s. And Timothy Leary, was a big advocate for sort of mass consumption of psychedelics. And it began to be seen as part of the kind of, rebellious wave that was sweeping through the 1960s. Mm-hmm. That kind of, crested, and then sort of as a return wave, there was a lot of repression and sort of hostility against this opening. What I talk about in my book, I describe the 60s as a failed mass cultural voyage of shamanic initiation. Yes. And I think there was a lot of these kind of energies coming into the society, and people really didn't know how to deal with it. And they didn't have the kind of rituals and understanding that shamanic cultures have, but how to use these substances and how to think about, plant spirits or other realms. So they would kind of go out into these realms and kind of just fall apart. I think you actually can hear that in the music in the late 60s. So what's interesting to me is now it's 30 years later, and there's been a lot more discovery, a lot more sort of like people like Rick Strassman and Terence McKenna have been working in this area, and I think there's a lot more intelligence that we can bring to bear on how to utilize these substances.
So essentially, you're saying that we approached it in a very immature way back in the 60s.
Yeah, you can almost say, the way I think about it now, it's almost like a kind of binary logic. Our culture is very invested in repressing the shamanic and the mystical and the archaic, and yet these forces are, sort of threatening to erupt back into modern life, and in many ways. So mm-hmm. It's really a question of learning to channel these energies, and also to kind of integrate this kind of ancient shamanic wisdom of these other realities with our kind of modern scientific empirical ways of knowing. And I think it can be done, and I think it will be done. It's going to be tricky. Quantum physics definitely points the way. We know from quantum physics that the observed and the observer are kind of totally connected.
Right.
It's sort of like we have to bring these highfalutin concepts. I mean, we have to earth them. We have to bring them down into ourselves, and really then, that'll create a big paradigm shift, I think.
I wish Michael Talbot was still with us. You mentioned him in your book, who wrote The Holographic Universe.
Yeah, I mean, that was an important book for me, definitely.
Me too.
I thought about that one a lot.
Yeah, he was a dear friend of mine. When Michael was dying, in fact, the night he died, I had contact with him spiritually as he was dying. It was an extraordinary life. Michael was a great master who had come into a small life and did a very extraordinary thing in that writing of that book. But the point I'm trying to make is that the earthing of the hologram is what it's really about, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also, I hope that my book is a kind of just valuable act of articulation, because I think we're at this point now where we need to have a more precise understanding of these things. And, I feel really lucky and grateful to have been able to make this investigation and to learn what I did, and I was very surprised at how much there was to learn, how much there still is to learn. So, earthing the hologram, I guess, is one way to look at it. We need to, as I've been really interested in the ideas of Jose Arguelles, who was behind the harmonic convergence, and he talks about, making science as sacred as the reality it investigates. We have to realize that, we are living in a sacred reality. It's not something that's outside of us. We just have to recognize that again.
He was, I had him on this program a while ago talking about his new book, Time in the Technosphere, and he's beginning to go in the direction of thinking that we are out of time synchronization. We're not in a real time. We're in an invented time, and I think that he would be saying that this is preventing us from harmonizing in such a way that we can have access to these other levels of reality.
Exactly. And I mean, for him, the whole last 5,000 years of recorded history, in a sense, are an aberration. They're a kind of timing error. And but if you look at it on a different scale, there was a kind of purpose to that, which was to force human evolution to the next level. And one way that's actually probably going to take place is by the kind of amount of destruction we've enacted in the biosphere is actually just going to force a quick evolution of human consciousness. We're not going to be able to be clinging to, our own pot of gold and stuff in the same way. We're really going to have to, form communities and also, I think, work with these kind of elemental forces and other levels of reality to keep our ship afloat.
Well, I think that whatever the full catastrophe is waiting for the biosphere, waiting to unfold in the biosphere, is going to unfold. I don't think that we will prevent that. I think that part of our journey is to face the arrogance and the denial of soul that made us do that. I thought that your identification of this process of the denial of soul was so important, made your book so wise for me. Your quote of Jung, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own souls. Am I right in thinking that that's really the essence of the problem?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I would say that's definitely one of the cruxes of the matter. And, it is very painful to face your own soul. I mean, your own soul is full of all sorts of stuff that you can't even really imagine. But it is coming to the point very quickly that people are going to have to make that reckoning.
Now, as you began to need to take this journey, you write, and I quote, "I felt as if I were becoming a ghost, a disembodied survivor from some distant epoch. I realized that if this monotonous, materialist culture was the end of history, as some writers proclaimed, without spiritual reality, without access to any other level of consciousness or meaning, then for me, life was almost intolerable." You were at a real point of spiritual crisis then.
Definitely. I mean, I definitely just couldn't see, even if I, sort of enacted my greatest ambitions to become a novelist or, successful magazine writer in New York, I just didn't even see the purpose. I just felt that there was nothing within the system as I understood it that interested me as a kind of possibility. And I was very skeptical. I didn't really think, I was completely skeptical. I grew up sort of an atheistic household. I really didn't think that there was any kind of spiritual reality. I never expected to, be taking visions and dreams and prophecies seriously. So I think that gives the book a lot of freshness because you're really seeing somebody who is, kind of fighting against what he's learning and
Yes.
finally, reaching this point of acceptance that there are all these other levels and that, ultimately probably the spiritual takes priority. I mean, I guess that's what I would think.
You get to this point. It's a dark night of the soul situation, not to put a too fine a point on it. It's a point many people have gotten to, and a point that many people with living spirits get to, especially in this society, that offers apparently no surcease, no way out.
Yeah, and I think it's actually,
what did you do?
I think it's first of all, I think it's very necessary that people go through their own personal apocalypses, which is basically what it is.
Yes.
And it's the only way the society is going to move towards healing, is if many people confront their own shadow and just go through this whole darkness of the nihilism and everything. I mean, so for me, I remembered that in college I'd had psychedelic experiences with mushrooms and LSD, so I decided to learn more about that and explore it, more precisely. And then I had some assignments. I got an assignment to take ayahuasca, which is this Amazon psychedelic.
Now, you say you got an assignment to do it. Where did the assignment come from?
I think I wrote about that for the Village Voice.
Ah, yeah.
And that was a kind of semi-illicit downtown gathering with some shamans from out of town.
So ayahuasca is illegal to take in the United States?
No, it's a very big gray area right now. It's actually being contested in a lot of really interesting legal cases.
What does it taste like?
What's that? I'm sorry?
What does it taste like?
It tastes incredibly bad. I mean, it varies to a certain extent, but all of the organic psychedelics taste very, very bad.
Very bitter?
And I think there was one American shaman who said to me, white man medicine make you feel good first, bad later. Indian medicine make you feel bad first, good later. And I think that's a very good point. I mean, these things make you sick, you throw up, but then you have these incredible visions and you feel like this kind of healing can take place. But the big assignment I got, which really launched me on the book, is I got an assignment to go to Gabon, which is a small country in West Africa on the equator. And there I went through a initiation into the Bwiti tribe. And they're the only tribal group in Africa that uses a kind of traditional shamanic psychedelic kind of culture. And they have a substance called iboga, which is the bark it's a root bark, which they powder. And it tastes incredibly bad, like much, much worse than ayahuasca even.
Even more bitter.
Much, much worse. And you basically go on a sort of journey that lasts 25 or 30 hours where you pass through these different phases. And some of it is visionary, but a lot of it is intensely psychoanalytic and personal. When I did it in Africa, I sort of felt like I was being shown a sort of holographic replay of my life up to that point.
The story that you tell of this in the book is so fascinatingly fun. I have to ask you, I was so curious, have you kept up with the people in Gabon or with the gentleman who took you there at all?
Well, the person who took me to Gabon, as I write about in the book, he told me when I went down there that the last time he'd taken iboga, he had a vision that he was going to not live very long. And, he was kind of shaken up by this, and I didn't really take it seriously at the time. But then about 2 years later, I got an email that he had, in fact, died in a freak accident.
Really?
So I've talked to his sister a little bit. And I am still in touch with the botanist who took me down to the Amazon, who I thought was a really great guy.
Well, tell us more about the experience. First, is Gabon still holding together?
Yeah, Gabon actually seems to be one of the more peaceful countries in the region. It's small. It has, some oil, so it's not totally poor. It's got a lot of jungle. And, it doesn't have any, big tribal conflicts. And it may be that iboga and the Bwiti cult is part of the reason that it's relatively peaceful.
Now, what does the word Bwiti refer to exactly?
Well, Bwiti, according to my guide, just means ultimately it's the essence of the experience of this plant, which is, he said it was the essence of love. But, definitely the iboga trip has its characteristic. It's, in a way, it's, very stern and patriarchal. And actually, I recently did it again for a second time down in Mexico, writing a piece for LA Weekly about these new ibogaine clinics that are sprouting up around.
And why would ibogaine clinics be sprouting up? There's a specific reason for that.
Ibogaine has a very interesting process with power on something on the order of a miracle cure for drug addiction of all sorts. Heroin addicts, cocaine addicts, alcoholics. I mean, it's not really. I can't really say it's a cure, but it seems to have very marvelous properties. I mean, people go through the one long ibogaine trip, and they have no craving for the substance they were addicted to, and they have no withdrawal symptoms of any kind.
This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We're talking to Daniel Pinchbeck, Breaking Open the Head, a psychedelic journey into the heart of contemporary shamanism, searching for some kind of connection to other realms. Daniel, before we left the area, you were talking about something that was really fascinating to me, which is the ibogaine clinics that are opening up in Mexico.
And Vancouver, Canada, and other parts of South America and in Europe.
So someone could actually go to one of these places and do this now.
Exactly.
Quite
in fact,
safely.
At the moment, the one in Vancouver, I think, is actually offering free treatment.
For addicts.
For addicts.
Because it's so fascinating that this substance actually... Now, why does it, do you think, does it reduce does it cure people of addictions?
Well, I mean, I have to say, first of all, my first experience taking it in Africa, I mean, I got a very clear message from the trip about my own use of alcohol, and I really saw like how alcohol was devastating my personal relationships with women, and it was affecting my writing. And afterwards, I really felt like just less inclination to drink a lot. And even it's been like 6 years later now, and I never have really taken up drinking again. So, and it wasn't that I was an alcoholic, but I was just kind of a New York social drinker. So that's one aspect of it. One aspect is the psychoanalytic aspect. It really takes you to the root of your faults and your problems and shows you, what's up with your life and what you're doing to avoid things. But the other aspect seems to be more, physiological. I mean, sometimes when heroin addicts take it, they actually don't have any visions at all. They just feel this incredible buzzing in their head for about 15 hours. And what seems to be happening, or at least one theory, I mean, nobody really knows for sure, is that ibogaine somehow is knitting back together the relationship between the brain hemispheres, between the left and right hemisphere. And the idea is that addicts are often people who were, had childhood abuse or some lousy thing happened to them in childhood, and, it caused a kind of defect in the relationship between the brain hemispheres. So as they've gotten older, they've sort of used some drug to just get over that imbalance or that depression that the imbalance causes. So this seems to go back to the root of things and repair the damage. And how it does this and leaves no withdrawal symptoms at the end is another mystery. I mean, it seems to just block the receptor sites, for the drugs. So it is kind of a miracle. Now, I'm going to tell you, when I just did it,
of course, it's not available. Would never be made available in the United States. Under this administration, there'd be no chance.
Well, it is a Schedule I substance, but that's really ridiculous because there's no hedonistic use for this. And but the reason it would never be made legal here is because it's the drug companies really couldn't profit on it. I mean, we tend to go for drugs that maintain people in a situation of dependency daily.
Right.
And here's a kind of substance that really is a kind of cure. So when I took it again in Mexico, I had a kind of vision of this black man in a suit who came out to kind of engage me in conversation. It's kind of a closed-eye vision. And, I understood that this was the spirit of Iboga. It was Mr. Iboga. And I could talk to him, and I could ask him questions. I would get these answers. They would be sort of shouted down in my head. And, the first thing I asked him is, Mr. Iboga, what is Iboga anyway? And by the way, it's known as ibogaine. It's kind of the westernized version of it. And the answer I got was, primordial wisdom teacher of humanity.
Was this the same as the wooden being that sat on the bench in Gabon that you didn't really know how to talk to?
No, it wasn't. It was a different manifestation. And I think that these kind of beings, can manifest in different ways. I mean, with ayahuasca, a lot of times people see snakes. Sometimes they see jaguars. Sometimes they see, ancient Indian shamans. It's kind of like, if we believe that these are kind of entities in their own realms, they can sort of take masks in different ways. So then I was shown a whole catalog of my own faults and stuff, and I got pretty depressed. I was like, these faults seem kind of small, Mr. Iboga. Do these things really matter? And the answer I got shouted back in my head was, everything matters.
Good Lord, how disturbing.
Just to give you a sense of the sort of characteristics of Mr. Iboga. And then later on, I was thinking about the state of the world and all these terrible wars and ecological crises and, what's going to happen to humanity. And the answer that was shouted back in my head was, everything is safe in God's hands. And, normally I would never think in this kind of language. I mean, I would never think about God's hands. I would never think about primordial wisdom teacher. And I have to say that I did feel a lot of relief after I heard that from Mr. Iboga. I felt that was, something to keep in mind.
In what sense safe? Because that's a very profound thing that you just said.
Probably in a larger, karmic. I mean, one thing that I personally took from this whole sojourn that my book describes, I ended up with pretty much a, suspicion that reincarnation and karma are real active forces. And, we may not be able to see, we may see just the misery of the moment, but we may not be able to see the larger patterns of people having the experiences they need to have in order to, reach a higher state.
That's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. And let's go back a little bit to Gabon. We only touched on that, and that is just a marvelously interesting story. Tell us about you went on a website. You found somebody who was in South Africa who would guide you to the initiation.
Right. He was an ethnobotanist, and he'd been working with Iboga, and he thought he had a great relationship with the shaman, the king, Mutombo. But actually, it turned out that it wasn't such a great relationship because the king got very greedy on us and began to try and demand more money from us before.
I have to tell you that it must have been terrifying at the time, but the story of what happened when the king started trying to get more money out of you is really hilarious, deeply funny.
Yeah, it was terrifying. And then after it was over, it was like the most hilarious thing I'd ever experienced in my life.
Yes.
When we were back at safe at the hotel, I just laughed, and it almost felt like, hyper real or something. The whole thing was like some kind of strange fantasy.
And you were with there was another person on the tour.
There was actually turned out to be a psychoanalyst from New York who was an older woman, and she was just a sort of funny character. I was not expecting to meet another local out there, but I would have an exotic experience for once.
Have you kept in touch with her at all?
Actually, I haven't, and I should contact her.
Yeah, find out what happened to her.
Yeah, I've been in touch, I said, more with people from the Amazon when I went down there.
Well, let me ask you another question. I sort of want to jump around a little bit because we're sort of staying in Gabon, but a question that begs to be asked. These alkaloids that are in these plants are so complex, molecular complexity. They're extraordinary substances, among the most complex substances in nature. And yet, is there any natural function that they have in the plants? Why did the plants evolve them?
That's really unknown. And as far as is known, there's no natural function for them.
No natural function.
So that's a very interesting question.
Terence
you
McKenna,
get into the idea of the Gaian mind or something, or Terence McKenna, called psychedelics sort of exopheromones, kind of these chemicals created by one species to change the behavior of other species.
Right. And that gets me, I just want to, as I say, we're sort of going to jump around.
Whatever.
It gets me to this story of this mushroom. What a remarkable story. The implication that these other species are somehow conscious in a way that is so far beyond our not understanding but expectation that we have never guessed that they were. Tell us a little bit about the fly agaric experience.
Oh, right. Well, this was not my experience. It was a story from a friend of mine.
Yes.
And this is a friend of mine who actually is basically, I mean, he's a North American shaman, and he's from Massachusetts, and since he was a young man, he had these kind of initiation dreams and experiences that kind of brought him further and further into the shamanic realm. And one night he had a dream where he saw these three red and yellow mushrooms growing in his backyard. Mm-hmm. And a couple of months later, he went into the backyard, and there they were, just as he'd seen in the dream. So he knew enough to recognize this as a sign. And he cut the mushrooms, and he found out what they were, and he read about them, and he found out they were Amanita muscaria, and that they were used by shamans in a certain way. So he dried them. And
do they grow naturally in Massachusetts?
Yeah, they grow. It's a different strain than the one. They're the famous mushrooms of Siberia, and in Siberia they're red and white. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people suggest that they're connected to the Santa Claus legend, because the Siberian shamans would feed them to the deer and stuff. So one night he and a friend took these mushrooms, and they waited like an hour and a half. Nothing really happened. He decided to go and get a beer from his refrigerator. He went to the kitchen, he got the beer, he opened it up, he turned around, and suddenly there, standing before him, were the three mushrooms. But they were 5 feet tall, 4 feet tall, and 3 feet tall. And they had little mouths and eyes, and they were, definitely looking right at him. And he said that they seemed about as solid as, any object would seem. Mm-hmm. And the mushrooms looked at him for a minute, and finally they said, "Why did you eat us?" And he thought about it for a second, and he answered, "I was following my dream." And the mushrooms actually conferred for a little bit. Then they said to him, "Are you prepared to follow this path?" And he intuitively said yes. And then the mushrooms vanished. And that was the only psychoactive experience he had the night from the mushrooms. And it took him a few years before he realized that the path he'd agreed to follow was plant shamanism.
Now, however, a friend of his didn't have quite the same experience.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he told me that a friend of his... and by the way, I mean, you can look at this. I mean, he didn't know about the sort of lore of these mushrooms, but if you read the book, The Long Strange Trip, it's very common that people will take these mushrooms and have them appear as, that's beings like this.
That's the thing that was so extraordinary about DMT, about the spirit molecule, is that it was as if the people were not only seeing into the same world, but that when they would go on one trip and then weeks later or months later on another trip, the world that they were seeing into had changed and evolved. Seasons would come and go, as if it was entirely real.
Right. Yeah. Well, what's interesting is, my experience with DMT was not exactly like that. But let me just finish the story.
Yeah, let's finish the story. This is such a cool story.
Basically, so when his friend took the mushrooms, the three mushrooms appeared in the same way, or 3 or 4, whatever it was. And they said to him, "Why did you eat us?" And he shrugged and said that he was trying to get high. And the mushrooms said to him straight out, "Well, if you do this again, we're going to kill you."
In other words, they're there for a purpose.
Exactly. My friend, the shaman's kind of attitude about them was that, they're beings that are kind of, on their own kind of journey through the cosmos, and they're here to work with humanity, with people who have the right intention, but otherwise they don't want to be messed with.
And, the issue of belief comes into your mind when you're writing about Robert. And why did you decide to believe him? Couldn't he have been just funning you?
Yeah, I mean, that's that's a very big question. And, basically I think that I just believed him because I believed him. I listened to his stories, I listened to the way he spoke to me, and I said, this guy's telling me the truth. And that was what my heart told me in a way. And, we're so suspicious in this culture. And yeah, I mean, a lot of people are con artists or freaks or whatever. But, we also have to trust our own experience. It's like people can have their own psychedelic experiences and their own visions to these other realms and not believe that they've had their own experience. They don't trust their own evidence.
The reason I asked the question was the Western world made a decision after and during the time of the Roman Empire and after the fall of the Roman Empire. Our decision was that we would not believe him. We would not. And we burned down most of the people who did things like this all through the Middle Ages.
Yeah, I mean, you can't exactly say that we didn't believe them. We actually took them at face value, but we just said that what they were doing was cavorting with demons.
Well, I'm saying that we decided not to believe them. I didn't say they weren't right.
Yeah. Well, the first thing was we decided they were evil and had to be destroyed.
Right.
And then when we reached modern enlightenment, and that didn't make sense anymore, because if you're an enlightened person, there can't be other entities and demons. Obviously, humanity is the only kind of consciousness that could exist.
Yes.
Then, we repressed, ridiculed, and suppressed the information. And anybody who brings up the subject again is it's just like not polite table talk for the most part.
This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We'll be back in just a couple of minutes. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We're talking to Daniel Pinchbeck, Breaking Open the Head, a psychedelic journey into the heart of contemporary shamanism. On Dreamland, we're not at all adverse to the idea of a psychedelic journey, and it turns out that you can quite legally get into the experience of into this experience in Canada now and in Mexico. Is it something, Daniel, do you think you would just say anyone should try or not?
I think that people know for themselves whether they have a predilection in this area, and I really wouldn't advocate or want to propose somebody do it if they're not completely interested. And obviously we know that our country frowns on most of these experiences, and a lot of these substances are illegal here. So, one really good way to do it is to hook up or visit a shamanic culture, where it's really part of their tradition. And that's also what I did when I went down to the Amazon and visited this tribe in the Amazon in
Tell us
Ecuador.
a little bit about that.
Well, that was really an amazing, lucky trip, because it was this botanist who'd really done his work. He'd lived with this tribe for years. He'd built a house for the shaman. He really took care of these Indians and Sequoia, and they really trusted him. And he was probably the only white guy who hadn't tried to rip them off in some way. So when he brought people there, they really treated them like family. And the shaman, this is a tribe that was 30,000 people at the turn of the century, last century, in 1900. It's down to 750 people.
Oh.
350 in Peru and 400 in Ecuador. And they're down to their last great shaman, Don Cesario, this guy in his 80s, who definitely has the kind of vibe of a deep Tibetan master.
And nobody to come after?
What's that?
Nobody to come after.
He does have apprentices. And I think actually, at this point, there's a kind of, for a long time people were saying that ayahuasca, that psychedelic tourism or shamanic tourism was a bad idea. But actually, I think now it's the opposite, that it's actually good for these cultures if it's done with the right spirit, that Westerners, rich, wealthy Westerners from TV land go down there. And I think we were, when we were there was an ayahuasca ceremony where Don Cesario's grandson, his 14-year-old kid, participated. He'd never done it before. He took off his basketball sneakers and Michael Jordan T-shirt for one night, and went into the tribal gear. So I think that we're actually, our interest can keep these kind of sacred traditions alive right now, and they recognize that. Apparently, one thing that's happened with ayahuasca, which is considered really the most sacred substance of the Amazon basin.
Yes.
Shamans in the last 10 or 15 years, when they take the ayahuasca, are getting the message reiterated to them that now is the time to share their knowledge with the outside world. Whereas before, I think they were much more reticent about that. So we felt, I felt really lucky. I felt that the Sequoia had really preserved an incredible tradition of ayahuasca shamanism, and it was just very beautiful. These ceremonies, we all lay in hammocks, and you drank this bitter-tasting ayahuasca, then you saw these incredible visions, and they would sing all night. And their singing was really basically like a sort of technology which they would use to guide you through different realms and different spaces. And they would kind of stop between their songs and in their own language have little discussions to make sure that they were all going to the same place. So it was pretty amazing how much they knew about what they were doing.
I was very amused by the Indians' description of ayahuasca as forest television.
Yeah.
That was a great phrase. And let me just read a quote from Jeremy Narby in chapter 23 of your book that's so deeply revealing. It was something I thought was really valuable to me, and maybe it will be to everybody. they explain that I am, he comes face to face with two 50-foot boas after drinking ayahuasca. Okay. They explain that I am just a human being. I feel my mind crack, and in the fissures I see the bottomless arrogance of my presuppositions. It is profoundly true that I am just a human being, and most of the time I have the impression of understanding everything, whereas here I find myself in a more powerful reality that I do not understand at all, and that, in my arrogance, I did not even suspect existed. And you know what I was reminded of? I was reminded of watching a cat or a dog sleeping on the living room floor peacefully while the family goes through all kinds of turmoil and changes that the animal can have no real conception of. And this was like something that thrust us up out of our level into another level. And I'm wondering if maybe as individuals and as a society, this is the direction we've got to go in.
Oh yeah, I totally think that's correct, and I think this is going to be part of the evolutionary shift that's already underway. One thing that I read about in my book, and I was told at the end of the visit to the sequoias that they said that sometimes when they would do these ceremonies and they would be in a trance all night and all singing together, at the end of the night the shaman would look down at his hand and he would have like a new plant in his hand or a new seed, and that would be a medicinal plant they needed for some purpose, And at first, of course, I didn't really believe that. I thought about it a lot. But then, later on in the course of researching, I began to have some really strange phenomena, like poltergeist phenomena.
Oh, really?
I collected a huge number of stories of people who'd had, like, materializations and all this other stuff.
This interests me a great deal because, of course, I don't know if you are familiar with my books, but
yeah.
I have had these manifestations really very, very intensely without any use of any psychedelics that I was aware of.
Right.
And so tell me a little bit more about the physical manifestations.
Well, the main thing that happened to me, first of all, was like, I just wanted to finish my point.
Sure.
Which is that I think that they do actually do what they say that they do. I think that they can sing plants into being, and it's through this kind of profound negotiation of these kind of elemental beings that, exist on a different level. That are for them, or it's like for them also, there's no difference between the natural and the supernatural world. It's a complete continuum. And I think that's very important because what's going on right now is a kind of change in our relationship to the natural world.
Right.
And that automatically causes a change in the relationship to the supernatural world because there's no difference. I mean, it's all synced together. And in a way, we have to overcome a naive kind of dominator mentality about the natural world.
Yes.
And realize that the only way to survive is as a symbiotic, integrated organism in a kind of, natural ecological system.
No, I think that this splitting, like we split everything into soul and body, supernatural and natural, et cetera, and so forth, is fallacious. I don't even believe in the supernatural. I think it's all nature. That doesn't mean I don't believe it, that these remarkable things are there, but I don't even think, for example, the soul, the dead are part of the supernatural. I think they're all part of nature. Just that we don't perceive them as part of nature simply because we can't see them.
Yeah, and I think that eventually we're just going to move to, our minds are going to change. I mean, our consciousness is going to change, and we're going to move to a different state of understanding and articulation. And I think it's going to happen quite quickly now for those people who are willing to go in this direction. I mean, for those people who want to suppress, any kind of thought in this area and just cling to the materialist paradigm, I think they're going to have a very, very hard time of it in the next 10 years.
I think a very hard time, and I think they're really going to be screaming, and I think that we're beginning to already hear that screaming. I think you hear it every day when you turn on Rush Limbaugh, when you listen to fundamentalist Muslims screaming or fundamentalist Christians screaming, or people clinging to the old materialisms in the West and the institutions, including religious institutions, that support them, although fallaciously.
Right. I mean, so you asked me the question about manifestations?
Yes.
And that was after I had this experience with a substance, DPT, dipropyltryptamine, which oddly enough is actually not an illegal substance anywhere except in Maine, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not exactly a pleasure trip. I mean, it was a short-acting, very powerful hallucinogenic, similar in chemical construct to DMT, dimethyltryptamine. And basically it reveals a completely different realm, which to me was, at the time, seemed very diabolical. It seemed like sort of super advanced, very glamorous. I felt like, I was watching this amazing kind of party going on, this incredible scenes of this kind of astral plane with all these beings in their kind of Edwardian outfits swinging around. It very much was like Western occult, kind of Aleister Crowley-esque. And after this experience, it was like I'd taken a being from that realm back into me, or into this realm, and I began to have all of these visions and synchronicities and these crazy dreams of being pursued by this guy in a sort of suit and a little beard. And then one night, right when I lay down to go to sleep, a mirror fell off the wall. The next morning I got up and I went to get a yogurt. I opened the drawer to get a spoon, and there was this really strange-looking, like honey brown, Egyptian-looking bug under the spoons, and it just took off, went back into the drawer. And that whole night in between, I'd had this dream of the same guy hitting me over the head with a pillow again and again, and laughing gleefully.
Wow.
So then I realized that I actually had to do something here. And luckily, I had a friend who was kind of a witch, and she came in, and we tried to do an exorcism with tarot cards and obsidian and so on. And this was nothing that I ever believed in or thought about. It was just suddenly it was like presented to me as something I had to deal with. And,
this is we're going to take a little.
And then also doing some meditations, trying to sort of reintegrate this entity or this energy. Everything was back to normal again.
We're going to take a little break now, Daniel.
What's that?
We're going to take just a little break.
Sure.
This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We're back. We're talking to Daniel Pinchbeck, Breaking Open the Head, a psychedelic journey into the heart of contemporary shamanism. Dare you look at this? Dare you? Well, you have to decide that for yourself. But it's something that a lot of people are beginning to realize is maybe has been neglected in our culture, has not been looked at in the right way, and there are very wise, very ancient shamanic cultures around the world that have a really different attitude towards these other realms. So, Daniel, before we left the air, you were talking about a rather remarkable experience of this manifestation that became quite physical in the world around you. And after you worked with the witch, did it go away, or did you want it to go away?
It did go away, but I definitely felt a little bit changed afterwards, in kind of a positive way. I actually felt like sort of zingier and smarter.
Mm-hmm.
And I began to think about it as a kind of genie or jinn kind of experience, which is sort of in the old Arabian Nights sense. I mean, then I was really looking around for a while, sort of flailing around, trying to understand the Western esoteric tradition, because this experience had been so completely connected to that, I felt. And ultimately, I met a friend who'd gotten very deep into the ideas of Rudolf Steiner, who was an Austrian clairvoyant and the founder of Anthroposophists.
Right.
And I found the way he articulated the subject to be very, very useful. And he talked about these kind of different. He's sort of an esoteric Christian in a sense, and he sort of splits, the devil, which the Bible talks about, into these different kinds of forces, which are always trying to sort of work on humanity and divert us into sort of wrong channels. And he splits it into the Ahrimanic and the Luciferic. And Ahriman is kind of the dark earth spirit, which is leading us down to materialism and technology and the mineral world and death. And Lucifer is the kind of proud light bringer, who's bringing us up to, the world of imagination and fantasy and hubris and pride. And so I felt this was kind of like a Luciferic initiation on my part. And for whatever reason, I mean, a lot of people take the subs and don't have any experience like this, but for whatever reason, it was something that I had to go through at that point.
But there's a very ominous quality to it at the same time.
It was definitely ominous. It was it was kind of contemptuous. I kind of felt like they were, there was a realm of beings who kind of, needed us in some way, but had sort of contempt for us. I mean, and that's pretty much, then when I read Steiner, that's pretty much exactly how he describes the Luciferic beings. I mean, they're beings that, are far ahead of us in some ways in their evolution, but, like superhuman almost, but in other ways are behind us because we chose a slower and kind of more moralistic path of evolution.
Mm-hmm.
But when you get involved with a Luciferic being, it can sort of speed ahead your sort of spiritual, psychic evolution in certain ways. So it's not really a bad thing, but it's just a danger. The Ahrimanic beings are much more dangerous and much worse for us. And basically, our society right now has become very Ahrimanically tainted.
Yes, and it's gonna bust up in some pretty spectacular ways, I think, because of that. I want to go back now to Gabon, to something that we did not discuss, which I thought was a very important factor in the book, and I don't want to finish without getting into this, and that is the remarkable experience of the tribesman's vision of your grandmother.
That was really amazing. I mean, that was one of the things that really first keyed me into this whole realm as being something that, definitely was more than I had ever imagined. I mean, there was this guy. This was the second ritual we did with this shaman and his tribe, and one of the guys had been eating iboga root all night, and his eyes got very big and white. And I was sitting by the fire, and he said that because I hadn't seen the first shaman had been angry at me because I was supposed to see all of these beautiful visions.
That guy was a real, I have to tell you, he was a creep.
Yeah, I kind of liked him. In retrospect, I actually want to go and talk to him again someday. But anyway,
you can afford it.
This shaman in this other tribe said that he saw my mother's mother, my grandmother, hovering over me, and that she died recently, and she loved me very much, and she was preventing me from seeing visions and seeing the other world.
Why was she doing that?
Well, it kind of made sense. I mean, so the funny thing about it was obviously he didn't know that my mother's mother had died recently, and also he couldn't have known that was really the only grandparent that I ever knew. The others had died before I was born, so it seemed like much more than a lucky guess.
Yeah, so that must have shocked you to your core.
She was a very repressive person. She was like clinging on to life. She was sort of had lived through depression and stuff, and always felt like a very kind of throttled person in a way. So there was this kind of negative force attached to her, which maybe after she died, she had, tried to attach onto me in some way.
You mention from Carl Jung's Memories, Dreams, Reflections, a really remarkable insight about this type of spirit. There are many human beings, Jung wrote, who throughout their lives and at the moment of death lag behind their own potentialities, hence their demand to attain in death that share of awareness which they failed to win in life.
Right. I mean, I definitely felt that was going on with her.
Right.
I mean, Rudolf Steiner said apparently he would, he would actually give lectures sometimes for the dead. And he felt that when you read like his anthroposophic texts, if you were conscious in your mind that you were reading them for your dead relatives, that would actually, or friends, that would actually have an effect. Like they would be able to pick up on some of the information, and it could help them in the spirit land. I mean, I know that sounds totally crazy, but I'm willing to entertain a lot of possibilities that 5 years ago would never ever have crossed my mind.
Yes. So it's work for you, in other words, this journey.
Yeah, I mean, I feel, I still feel like a man on a mission. I mean, I feel like, for whatever reason, I've been put in this very lucky position where I can kind of try to help, bridge the mainstream and the fringe, and try to really analyze and document and articulate, what's going on in these areas, and that's what I hope to do.
There is an enormous engine in our culture which is telling us from earliest childhood that the spirit world doesn't exist. It is scientific in origin. Some of it arises out of the early rationalism, out of Marxism, and from all different directions, and they converge in the modern skeptics movement and in secular humanism, it's called, scientific materialism. And it offers a lot of things that, at least superficially, seem to be very good, such as freedom from superstition and from all those lies and confusions. Are you saying we should go back to something, or were you talking about something new?
I don't think we should go back to superstition. I think that, Rudolf Steiner, once again, I think is very useful in this. And he said that we acquired, the modern ego and our freedom and our rationalism and our empiricism, so that we could, when we went back to this, into these other realms, we could go back as equals, not as kind of in an atavistic manner or prayerful. So that that's why what he talks about creating a spiritual science, And I think sometimes the words spiritual and spirit also kind of get in our way for thinking about this. That's why I'm hoping in a way, that we'll come up with a new kind of vocabulary at some point. When I took this last ibogaine experience, there was this incredible kind of buzzing in my ears, and it was really like, if you think about, these molecules are vibrating, and they change the level of vibration. We sense our consciousness as being seamless, but actually, I imagine it's a kind of waveform. And I think different psychedelics just change the kind of waveform, which changes the whole, spectrum of what we can perceive. So there may be like an infinite, number of these different variations or vibrational rates, and it may be that there are different kinds of encounters and possibilities awaiting us at these different rates.
Now, you discuss in the book very interestingly the problem of what to do with this. In other words, I'm referring to your discussion of people like Jonathan Ott, and it really is an enormous question, because now that it seems clear that we can readdress the whole world of psychedelics in a much more rational and perhaps less hedonistic way than we did back in the 60s. And when I say rational, I mean literally rational.
You mean really rational, not irrationally rational.
Exactly, really rational.
Well, I think that first of all, shamanism is going to have a purpose. We're seeing all these different. It's not just shamanism. There's yoga, Buddhist meditation, the esoteric, Kabbalah tradition. It's like the bad part of globalization is that it's destroying the planet, annihilating communities, and causing chaos. The good part is that it's opening up the world's spiritual traditions so that people can actually, think on many different levels about the possibilities of the world and of consciousness. So it's an evolving, very quickly evolving process, and I think that past the what William Lowen Thompson calls the catastrophic bifurcation point that we seem to be heading. I think that these substances are going to be very useful as deconditioning agents and as healing agents, and getting people sort of back on the right path. And ultimately, they may be superseded. We may not need them anymore. We may evolve to a point where we don't need any kind of aid. We'll just see what happens.
We'll see what happens, and it seems so urgent to me, and yet when you talked about being in God's hands, am I wrong to feel that urgency, do you think?
Well, I think that we should feel the urgency, but the kind of rush over pressing is not going to do the trick. It's like you need the what does the Tao talk about? The kind of action of non-action. And I think that we're definitely
walking
getting
the pathless path.
What's that?
Walking the pathless path.
Yeah, I think we're getting a huge spur to push forward in many ways now, and at the same time we have to breathe and we have to relax and we have to put one foot in front of the other and actually take the time to put our thoughts together. And that's something that I hope my book will help people do.
Well, it has a lot of wisdom in it. And not only that, it's loads of fun. Now, what adventures you've had. My God.
Yeah, it was good
really
stuff.
Amazing. And you just basically simply decided to do it. You decided to sort of take your own spirit at face value and see if it was there.
Yeah, and the other thing is it's like, I grew up totally atheistically, never had any use for the Bible or Christianity, But, in a sense, I do think that Christ was probably more or less who he said he was, a kind of being from a higher spiritual evolution who incarnated on the earth to perform a necessary mission at a certain point. And, if you just go straight back to his exact texts and parables, especially if you include the Gospel of Thomas and the Gnostic Gospels, a lot of the path is kind of laid out there. You have to open the doors for yourself, to know what is.
Well, Terence thought that magic mushrooms had been involved in the writing of the Gospels, I believe, didn't he?
Yeah, it's those kind of to me that's like over-literalization. It really doesn't matter. I mean, I think
I agree with you there, but it was a fascinating concept anyway.
Yeah, I think there was a mushroom cult in the early centuries of Christianity, but I don't think that had anything to do with Christ in himself. I think that was something different.
Now, we haven't talked too much directly about DMT, but you mentioned Rick Strassman's work, of course, prominently in here, as you should, and you describe DMT as mind expansion as shock therapy. What do you mean there?
Right. I mean, I've actually it's sort of interesting in a way, because if you think about, we have ayahuasca, which is one way of taking DMT through a kind of interface using other plants, and it lasts for 3 or 4 hours, and it can be very, can be very amazing. It can also be very gentle. But when we synthesize DMT, it's a little bit like when we turn opium into heroin, and it's very much of a product of our modern society to want to create the most bungee jumping kind of rush that we can create. But when you do smoke synthesized DMT, it is the most astonishing experience that one can have, in that you're instantly transported into a realm that is really undescribable by language. I mean, I tried to describe as best I could. I could say hyper-organic, but it feels like you have more sensory apparatuses operating there than you do here. And it's kind of mechanical in a way. It's kind of clown-like. It's kind of humorous. It's also dead serious. It's moving at an incredible rate, incredibly colorful. I mean, one way I tried to describe it was as sort of Tibetan mandalas meet Disney World in the 25th century. It's awesome and also a bit frightening. And I definitely think, for those people who are inclined, once in their lives, they should try to have this experience, maybe. And, it is interesting that DMT is a basic neurotransmitter. I mean, it's in our pineal gland, it's in the base of our spine, it's in all of these plants. It may be this kind of conducting fluid or whatever, conducting medium to this very overwhelming otherness.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's really fascinating. It's interesting. You speak about the kind of there seems to almost be a kind of very subtle parallelism between these worlds, as if even though they are profoundly different from this one, there's something about the way they proceed that is connected with this one.
Well, yeah, we couldn't have some access to these realms if there wasn't some connection. I mean, one thought I had about the DMT realm is that, they may be, entities that are just much, much more evolved they've evolved to a kind of spiritualized or hyper-organic state, and they may actually be somehow maintaining the holographic illusion of the physical reality that we live in through their meditations or their practices, I mean, I really, I'm as baffled as the next guy, trying desperately to, cover it with language.
There are people around who don't need, who live in this state without any psychedelic drugs.
Definitely.
And I'm one of them, to be honest with you. And what I've often wondered what would happen to me. I have been advised by everybody who knows me to stay away from psychedelics. One friend said, "Why would you bother? You've been high ever since the day you were born."
Well, I think what actually might be interesting for somebody like you would not necessarily be doing psychedelics, but actually go to a really great, profound shaman and have talk to them as an intermediary and see what they say.
Because a lot of people who are listening to this radio program are people like me. I mean, we're sort of all together. There's 200,000 people who listen to this radio, more than 200,000 in February.
Right. Well, as I said in my book, I mean, in tribal societies, 1 out of every 25 people, is roughly going to be a shaman, which means that, and that I think might actually just be a kind of almost biological cross-cultural dispensation. So that means in our culture there's how many? There's 10 million or more, people who naturally have a propensity for, interacting with these other realms.
You know what? I think we need them. I think we need a rescue force here very badly.
We do, but a lot of them have been, some of them are in mental institutions, some of them have just suppressed their own natural proclivities. And, and then you have to be very careful because these other, this sorcery is a danger, shamanism is a kind of counteractive force.
Mm-hmm.
And in these tribal cultures, they're very, very worried about sorcery.
You think it is a real danger?
What's that?
It is a real danger. I know it is because I've seen it work.
Oh,
yes.
yeah.
Tell me, have you ever had any experience with sorcery?
Good question. Except for my GPT experience, no, not.
Yeah, because I was going to say there were things getting ready to happen to you that I think would have really turned out to be very, very hard to deal with.
Yeah, well, the things that I did deal with were hard enough to deal with.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Well, you dealt with them beautifully, though, I think. But in the sense that I've known people who have kind of gone with that kind of manifestation until it became a reality around them, and things happen to them like they disappear and stuff. Really weird stuff happens to them.
The real Carlos Castaneda
stuff.
Yeah,
exactly.
Well, I'm convinced. I'm with you. I think that stuff is all something that we're capable of manifesting. So then the question is, and that's why somebody like Rudolf Steiner to me becomes totally valuable, because he's taking all this esoteric and occult information and he's giving it a very profound and very moral footing, so that you can follow his system and you can actually realize how to use these powers to help humanity and help yourself.
Daniel, you're living a life of highest adventure. Where next? What are you doing now?
Well, I'm actually writing a piece about Jose Arguelles for Rolling Stone. That's really interesting. And he actually was recognized as the closer of the cycle by 9 indigenous tribes in Mexico, which means that the cycle referring to what the Hopi prophecy or the Mayan prophecies kind of suggest. So, and I think that he is the one who's bringing together a lot of kind of shamanic indigenous wisdom with a kind of modern way of knowing.
I thought he had a very powerful spirit. When he was on our radio program, there was something in his voice that kind of leapt through the airwaves. It was pretty amazing.
Yeah, I think he's really an amazing guy. And I've also gotten very interested in the whole, crop circles, crop formations, and I wrote a little piece about them for Wired, and I'm planning to go back out there this summer and spend some more time thinking about what's happening there. And that also seems to, dovetail very nicely with a lot of Arguelles' thoughts about the Mayans and about the lunar calendar. They use lunar symbols and sort of planetary symbols all the time. So, as I said, just trying to, move towards a deeper level of articulation of these matters, if I can help.
Daniel, thank you very much for being with us. This has indeed broken open my head. Next up, Linda Moulton Howe. One reporter who loves mysteries is radio's leading science journalist, Linda Moulton Howe. She's an Emmy Award-winning TV producer and reporter and editor for EarthFiles.com, the Internet's most respected edge science website. Here she is, Linda Moulton Howe.
Thanks, Whitley. Since the middle of December, residents of Horton and Napoleon, Michigan, west of Ann Arbor, have been seeing some very strange lights and objects in the sky. Another mystery was a large, nearly perfectly round ice circle discovered on December 28th at Mud Lake near Horton. The ice circle was probably created by nature, but a local resident saw a bright light over the lake. As recently as this past weekend, on Saturday, February 7th, and 3 nights before on February 4th, a Jackson, Michigan resident videotaped unidentified objects and sent me copies of the tapes which do show unusual objects in the sky. The man is a professional who works in computer technology support and has asked that I not use his real name. So for this radio update, I will call him John. John is a 36-year-old man who has lived in Jackson, Michigan all his life. He remembers seeing bizarre diamond-shaped, oval-shaped, and triangular-shaped craft and orange lights back in 1992 when there was another UFO flap over Napoleon. But he has not seen any strange aerial lights since then until now. He and other residents from the Napoleon, Horton, Litchfield area of Michigan south of Jackson have repeatedly seen unidentified lights. You can see images and reports about this Michigan phenomenon at my website, www.earthfiles.com. In fact, I have frames from John's most recent February 7th videotape. Just go to the headlines page and click on the top Michigan UFO story. In John's videotape, he was first near the Jackson County Airport and then traveled to a bank in downtown Jackson where he went to an ATM machine for some cash. And here is what happened next.
And when I got near the ATM, I happened to notice that there were 3 curious orange dots in diagonal fashion. If you can think of a line 45 degrees from level to level ground, they were at that angle. And I stared at it for about 5 seconds because I wanted to see if it was moving, if it was an airplane or something else. And it was just stationary, so I assumed it was glare off of some building or maybe telephone or power wires. And then I just went to use the ATM, which took me less than a minute. And then when I came back out, I looked in that direction again, and the 3 dots had actually moved, but they hadn't moved very far, which it didn't make sense to me, because if it was a plane, then why wasn't it moving in the first place? And why didn't it move very far? It didn't make any sense to me. So I went back to my truck and I grabbed the camcorder again and I started videotaping the object.
And what appeared to be 3 points of light in a line that were orange turned out to do what?
Well, it was odd because the light on the left got really bright, and you can see it in the videotape. And the dot that was in the middle actually was lower, like the bottom of a flat V shape.
Mm-hmm.
And then the light on the right was small, like the lower dot in the middle. And I videotaped that for a short while this object was crossing the sky, and then I pulled back to get perspective of the building. And I regret that now, because what happened after that is I tried to zoom back in on it, and I lost it momentarily. And I used my eyes at that point to sight where it was at, so I could have better luck zooming in on it again with the camcorder. And what I noticed then with my eyes is that the object dimmed overall. All 3 lights seemed to dim. The one that was the brightest on the left dimmed the most, and they all dimmed until they were equal in brightness. And it was sort of like taking a light bulb and decreasing the power to it, so it gets dimmer and dimmer.
Right, like a rheostat.
Yeah, like that. And then it seemed to rise a little, and it continued across the sky, and I managed to reacquire it, and I followed it for a while, and it just looked like 3 small dots, and I never saw any blinking lights at all, which an airplane should have blinking lights that time of night.
Now, I've seen your videotape, and I'm so glad that you have been trying to capture these anomalies over Napoleon on videotape. And the thing that struck me was something trying to camouflage itself in the sky so that most people would not pay attention.
Yeah, that's the impression I get. It's sort of like they don't want to be that noticeable, but if you seem to take an interest in them, they will be noticeable. And I find it odd that as I would leave my apartment, I would see this light in such a position in the sky where it would be noticeable to me, because I sent you a picture of what I saw to the right, a daytime picture, when I first sighted the object that ended up over the airport. And you can see there's a section of the sky where, to be noticeable, the object would have to fit in this section of the sky. In other words, there are trees around, there are other objects, you couldn't see it.
Right.
It was just in the right location at the right time for me to see it. And it stayed long enough for me to run into my apartment again and get my camcorder and leave again. And it seemed to be patient enough to wait until I took the longest route through all the stop signs to the airport. And then seemed to wait around for me to park and get my camcorder ready and to start videotaping. And it stuck around for a while, minutes, 7, 8, 9 minutes, and I videotaped it. And it just seems odd to me that I was somehow always in the right place at the right time to lead me to this thing to start videotaping it. And the same thing with the second object over downtown Jackson. The lights that weren't moving, I kind of get the odd feeling that they were parked there waiting to be noticed, and then when I ignored them, used the ATM machine and came back out, then they started moving slowly. It's almost like it was choreographed, not by me, but by whatever intelligence is behind these lights. It's like if you take an interest in them, they will reveal themselves a little bit. That's just my impression.
And why you?
Probably just because I'm curious and I have a camcorder and I look up. I had started paying attention again after the ice circle, after you reported on that and the light associated with it. That's when I that's when I bought my camcorder. And I just waited, and it seemed to start with the Northern Hillsdale sighting that I had. That's when all of this seemed to start, and it was only last Wednesday.
And so if you hadn't heard my Earth Files and radio reports on the ice circle in Horton, you wouldn't have gotten the camera and you wouldn't have been looking for these lights.
Right, and Sunday night something else happened that was unusual.
What?
Sunday night, I got the same friend to go out into the Northern Hillsdale and Southern Jackson area. We drove around for, I'd say, an hour and a half, and sometimes we parked, but we didn't see anything. We went back to where he lives in the Horton area, which incidentally is not too far from the ice circle. And as I actually had made the tape at his house that I sent to you. And as I was leaving, I exited his house, and he was right behind me. And the first thing I saw was maybe 200 yards away, over a tree line, there was an orange glowing light. And I immediately said to my friend, just half jokingly, I said, "They're here." And he looked, and he saw the same light. And then I made a move to my left to walk a couple of paces, and I was going to get out my camcorder and start shooting again, and it disappeared. It was just gone. And I think back on it now, and I sort of think that whatever these lights are, they have a sense of humor, because we searched over a wide area for an hour and a half, 2 hours looking for these lights. And then at the exact moment we give up and I'm going home for the night, it's there. And then when I go to get my camcorder, it's gone. From
these ongoing sky mysteries in Napoleon, Michigan, we're going to go to the ground mysteries on Mars right after this break. This is Linda Moulton Howe reporting for Dreamland. Those rovers, Spirit and Opportunity, have been busy on Mars. Opportunity got up close to that bedrock near its landing site and surprised NASA and JPL planetary geologists when its spectrometers showed a very high percentage of sulfur in the rocks. Opportunity also had problems even making its wheels move without slipping because the soil and rocks are covered with small round stones that have yet to be identified. This week, I talked about the implication of so much sulfur and the mysterious round rocks with Dr. Ronald Greeley, Regents Professor of Geology at Arizona State University, who is also one of the 7 main chairmen of the Science Operations Working Group for the Spirit and Opportunity missions.
The measurements that have been made there suggest that there's a very high percentage of sulfur present in the material, and that there are these spherules that had been seen and reported on earlier. Those are still very curious features.
Now, what is the implication of sulfur generally as you look at the picture of Mars?
Well, sulfur is a common component in a lot of environments, but such a high percentage is unusual, and this is what leads some folks to consider the volcanic origin, or at least volcanic processes to be involved.
And what is the percentage of that with white stone now in terms of its sulfur content, and what else is there?
Well, the percentages, I don't believe those data have been released yet, but it's pretty high in comparison to most rocks we're familiar with. The additional findings are there are some minerals that have been identified in the mini-test results that would suggest the presence of a couple of minerals that form, again, in the presence of water. And in particular, if this is a volcanic terrain that we're looking at, for example, the accretionary lapilli idea, then the presence of these minerals might suggest that this was a hydrothermal area, and sulfur is a component of such environments.
And so the bedrock might be, if we were comparing it to the Earth, might have had an origin similar to, say, Yellowstone National Park.
Yes, to some parts of Yellowstone, that's right.
And all this is adding up to a question about whether the place where opportunity came down originally might have been hot magma coming up to the surface in some kind of volcanic activity, or at least hot springs?
Yeah, the evidence is sort of pointing toward the presence of a hot environment, hot for some reason. That's something that's under debate now. Volcanic activity, magma close to the surface is one possibility. The evidence we have so far is very suggestive that water was present. The question that's unanswered at this time is whether the water was a standing lake or a small sea, or if it was diffused throughout the rocks in the subsurface. We don't have the answer to that yet, but the observation of things like the cross beds and determining what the origin of the spherules might be, those will help answer that question of whether there was open water on the surface or not. And that's a fundamental question we're trying to glean the answer for.
Now, the spherules, or spherical small objects, they are about how big in the bedrock?
They're about 1 millimeter, 2 millimeters across.
And are they all over the slabs of rock?
Boy, they seem to be pretty pervasive, yes. You know, as a matter of fact, the wheels on the rover were sort of slipping as the rover is driving across that surface, and it's sort of like trying to travel over ball bearings. There are so many of them that it makes the traction a little difficult.
Wow, and has anybody ever seen anything quite like this anywhere on the Earth or the Moon?
Well, we have seen spherules of various forms, both on Earth and the Moon, and in some cases they are in similar concentrations. There are some impact craters on Earth that have small spherules that resulted from the impact that melted the rock, and then the melted blobs fell back to the surface and formed deposits that are several feet thick of mostly the spherules. In other cases, as was seen on the Moon, there are deposits of volcanic glass that forms little spherules. So these have been seen on Earth and the Moon in comparable quantities. But again, trying to figure out what the origin is for the features we're seeing on Mars is what we're trying to figure out right now.
And is it fair to say that we here on the Earth don't know of any context in which these kinds of sphericals could be formed unless it was in some kind of a heat melt process?
There is another mechanism. I think I mentioned that they could be precipitates. In other words, they could be precipitated from water. Think of it as a little grain of dust within the water, and chemical precipitates like salt and other things would form around that dust grain, and then those would settle down to the surface. So those can also form spherules.
Is it fair at this point to say, as we're speaking on February 11th, that there still is not the smoking gun yet, that water like a lake was anywhere the rovers have been so far?
That is correct. There is not definitive evidence for that at either site.
And that's what you're all looking for?
Right.
Communications between NASA and the rovers don't always work well, Dr. Greeley said, and recent commands to Spirit to drive toward another crater called Bonneville have been delayed. But if all goes well, Spirit will be roving in yet another crater soon. So stay tuned. This is Linda Moulton Howe, reporter and editor of EarthFiles.com, reporting for Dreamland.
Next week on Dreamland, Laird Scranton, the science of the Dogon, decoding the African mystery tradition. Did they receive visitors from another world thousands of years ago? Phenomenal new insights for subscribers. Linda Godfrey on that weird creature that was sighted in Wisconsin a few days ago. And Laird Scranton on December the 16th is going to be with us chatting live in the subscriber seconds are Whitley Strieber and Daniel Pinchbeck. Coming up on Dreamland over the next few weeks, we've got a lot of great stuff. William Henry's going to be with us to talk about his new Star Walkers book. Colin Wilson will be with us to talk about, of all things, the civilization of the Neanderthals and what may have really been going on back in the distant past. The legendary Colin Wilson, you heard that right. And so much else is coming up on Dreamland, so don't miss a single week. We're going strong, even after all of these years. I've been on the air, I guess, 7 or 8 years with Dreamland now, and enjoyed every minute of it, and I hope you do too. You could subscribe, by the way, to UnknownCountry.com and get a free copy of the hardcover Superstorm autographed by yours truly. I have autographed 25 copies. And you can get one absolutely free if you subscribe to Unknown Country for a 1 year, any 1 year subscription, new 1 year subscription. And we will send you a free autographed copy of Superstorm sometime next week, so you could conceivably give it as a Christmas present. Lovely idea. So please do support us with a subscription. We need you. Okay, here we go. Whitley Strieber, Daniel Pinchbeck, 2003.
I'm very happy to be talking to Daniel Pinchbeck, the author of a really cool book, Breaking Open the Head, a psychedelic journey into the heart of contemporary shamanism. As you know, something is missing in the Western world. People are going soul blind, they are soul dead, they are losing their touch with the numinous, and they are turning into, well, you see what's happening all around you. Reality television, unbelievable cruelties, people who no longer care about the value of their own beings. Well, someone like Daniel Pinchbeck does care. He cares a whole lot. He is a founding editor of...
It is our original interview with Daniel Pinchbeck from February of 2003 on his amazing book, Breaking Open the Head. And this is a long, searching, fascinating, absolutely wonderful interview, one of the best I ever did. It's marred a bit by the fact that we were still in the infancy of audio transmission over the Internet, and it's not of the quality that you're used to hearing now. There's a bit of sort of a background noise in it, but you can listen through it quite easily to the interview itself, and it is still wonderful, even after all of this time. I listened to it a moment ago. I was thinking, you hear me in there inveigling against all of the cruelties that are that come along with the soul blindness that's developing in our world. And I mentioned reality TV. Gosh, how times have changed in just a few years. I would have been 2003. I didn't think to mention something like what's going on in Iraq and all of the other terrible things that are taking place around us. But yes, innocence fades so very quickly. It's quite a remarkable interview, and I had a lot of fun doing it. A lot of you, after the recent Daniel Pinchbeck show, asked that this interview be repeated, and so here it is. And enjoy Breaking Open the Head. He turned out to be that book, a kind of watershed in our consciousness about who and what we are. It was a very, very important book, and I think the deepest and most complete interview he ever gave, because there's hardly a program left out there where somebody can be interviewed in this depth by an interviewer who's actually read what they've written or knows a little bit at least about what they're doing in just a few shows. Proud that this is one of them, and have a great Thanksgiving 2006. Now here, going back to 2003 and a few...
As a return wave, there was a lot of repression and sort of hostility against this opening. What I talk about in my book, I describe the 60s as a failed mass cultural voyage of shamanic initiation.
Yes.
And I think there was a lot of these kind of energies coming into the society, and people really didn't know how to deal with it. And they didn't have the kind of rituals and understanding that shamanic cultures have, but how to use these substances and how to think about, plant spirits or other realms. So they would kind of go out into these realms and kind of just fall apart. I think you actually can hear that in the music in the late 60s. So what's interesting to me is now it's 30 years later, and there's been a lot more discovery, a lot more sort of like people like Rick Strassman and Terence McKenna have been working in this area, and I think there's a lot more intelligence that we can bring to bear on how to utilize these substances.
So essentially, you're saying that we approached it in a very immature way back in the 60s.
Yeah, I mean, you could almost say, the way I think about it now, it's almost like a kind of binary logic. I mean, our culture is very invested in repressing the shamanic and the mystical and the archaic, and yet these forces are, sort of threatening to erupt back into modern life, and in many ways. So it's really a question of learning to channel these energies, and also to kind of integrate this kind of ancient shamanic wisdom of these other realities with our kind of modern scientific empirical ways of knowing. And I think it can be done, and I think it will be done. It's going to be tricky. I mean, quantum physics definitely points the way. We know from quantum physics that, the observed and the observer are kind of totally connected.
Right.
It's sort of like we have to bring these highfalutin concepts. I mean, we have to earth them. We have to bring them down into ourselves, and really then, that'll create a big paradigm shift, I think.
I wish Michael Talbot was still with us. You mentioned him in your book.
I don't even know if worlds is the right word. I'm not sure dimensions is the right word. I think we're going to learn that there are different forms of consciousness that manifest in different ways. They may be connected to rates of vibration or resonance, or we may need some kind of more scientific vocabulary at some point. But what's really exciting is that this is just when science feels it's got sort of things sewn up, this is a whole area that there's been a lot of repression and a lot of fear, a lot of confusion about. But it's an area of human curiosity that in the next millennium we're going to be putting a lot of energy into understanding.
You mention in your book, for over 30 years, a tremendous force of cultural repression has been exerted on the subject of psychedelics. Could you give us a little bit of the history of psychedelics in our country and what happened to blind us to this?
Sure. Well, I mean, basically in the 50s, LSD was discovered in the 1940s. And then the 1950s, it had like two tracks. On the one hand, the CIA was kind of investigating it. On the other hand, these psychotherapists and intellectuals and psychoanalysts began to work with it. And they were very amazed by what it did, and began to use it in different therapeutic ways. And there's a whole exploratory phase where it was used for obsessive, LSD and psilocybin mushrooms were being used for obsessive compulsive disorder and alcoholism, and bringing down recidivism rates in prisoners in jail. And there were a lot of very positive potentials there. But then the kind of genie got out of the bottle in the mid-'60s. And Timothy Leary, was a big advocate for sort of mass consumption of psychedelics. And it began to be seen as part of the kind of, rebellious wave that was sweeping through the 1960s. That kind of, crested and then sort of...
Open City, he's written for such publications as Rolling Stone, Men's Journal, The Village Voice. He has been around the block also in a very extraordinary area. Daniel has gone on a journey, a psychedelic journey, that's right, into contemporary shamanism, taking psychedelics in different places all around the world in order to find out if they open a window into the spirit. And Daniel, I'm very, very happy to have you with us.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, it's been an exciting experience reading your book. I have to admit that I would be severely punished by my school librarian for dog-earing all these pages in here. This is just so exciting. We had the author of DMT, The Spirit Molecule, on this radio program about a year ago, but that was before it was all internet, and there were a lot of things I couldn't say because, they wouldn't let me have you on, for example, because you had taken your psychedelics not under official supervision at all, but you did it in other countries where it was legal where you did it, but that didn't matter.
Right.
Now I'm free, and therefore we can talk about anything we want to. Anyway, we had him on, and he made a remarkable discovery for him, for a professor, during the course of his work, which he talked about on the air much more fully than in the book. And that's why I want to tell you what he said. He said that he felt that the people he was studying, who he was giving DMT to, were actually seeing into another world. And he had come to that conclusion really almost as he was finishing his book. Mm-hmm. Now, how do you react to that?
Well, I mean, it's not surprising to me at this point. I feel that there are, lots of other worlds